It's been almost 900 days since we started the terrarium, where not only plants but also living creatures live and develop without food. Let's remind ourselves how everything started. We've ordered a high-quality terrarium made of high-purity glass from a craftsman. Later, we went to the forest where we collected some forest soil, several types of plants, as well as cute living creatures called isopods. After adding the soil and plants to the aquarium, we introduced the isopods, gave them a piece of carrot, sealed the lid, and began observing. After finishing the carrot, the isopods began feeding on the moss and other plants, leading to a series of future consequences. Through our observations, we witnessed how isopods compete for dominance.
Fight!
How some individuals shed their skin and others eat it to replenish their nutrient reserves. We successfully created proper conditions for the isopods to live and reproduce. Sometime later, the moss in the terrarium was affected by some disease. Before it completely dried off, we removed the diseased plants and refreshed the terrarium's appearance, adding a wooden cliff with a lawn on top of it. Hoping to add some variety, we introduced these exotic white isopods inside the terrarium, which immediately befriended the grey ones. In 160 days, we noticed a small mushroom inside the terrarium, and then 4 more mushrooms appeared next to it. They grew very fast, but within a day, their stems couldn't bear the weight of the caps, so they fell to the ground and were eaten by the isopods. After a while, we finally saw dozens of little baby isopods, which were vigorously eating everything they could find in the terrarium. Besides isopods, the terrarium was also inhabited by the caterpillars, which tried to reproduce just like the isopods. Sometime later, the overpopulation of the terrarium resulted in a large reduction in the number of plants. Fortunately, at about the same time, the plantain plant started its rapid growth and provided the residents of the terrarium with additional food. One evening, we noticed a predatory millipede, which usually hunts at night, but that time it decided to do it in the daylight. In our case, this predatory millipede was supposed to help the terrarium slightly reduce its overcrowding and keep the population of living creatures under control. It grabbed a small isopod and, after injecting it with venom, began chewing it and sucking out its juices. After a while, the terrarium was not so beautiful and attractive. But that was expected, as the laws of nature still apply, even within our closed ecosystem. The 500th day in the terrarium, there was very little moss left, so the lives of the isopods were supported by the plantain and also the ivy plant. There was very little moss left, so the lives of the isopods were supported by the plantain and also probably the ivy plant. Do you remember the dry oak leaves we placed in the corner of the terrarium at its very beginning? Well, there was nothing left of them. Everything was eaten by the isopods in the first year of the experiment. At that point, most of the surface of the terrarium was just bare ground with isopods wandering on it. There was no vegetation left on top of the wooden cliff, and the cliff itself was gradually decreasing in size because the isopods ate it at night. Occasionally, I saw smaller isopods feeding on their fellows. Perhaps it just died of old age, or maybe, well, you know what I mean. The other side of the terrarium was completely covered with moss and green residue, apparently due to the fact that the light was coming from that direction. One of the dead leaves stuck to the glass of the terrarium, but hungry isopods reached it even there. Surprisingly, I spotted some previously unfamiliar springtails next to them. Their bodies were covered with reflective shells, and they helped the isopods in the disposal of biological garbage. In the beginning, this stick was completely covered in moss, but the moss and bark had been eaten long ago, and now all that's left is its bare wood. Another month passed, and the plantain reached its maximum mass and volume during the entire experiment. It may seem that the terrarium looks bad, and the isopods suffer a lot, but such a plantain plant was more than enough for them. I tried to count the number of individuals that inhabited the terrarium, but it was very difficult to do so, as many of them were afraid of the light. And as soon as it was turned on, they immediately ran away into their hideouts and caves, and came out of there only when it got dark again. I hadn't seen any new plants in the terrarium for a long time, but at one point a few sprouts started to emerge from the ground. I was so happy for the isopods that now they would have a lot more diversity, but they didn't realize it and ate the new shoots almost completely within a few days. The good news was that the ivy plant also started to grow very actively, and the isopods almost never ate its raw leaves. Apparently, they contained some kind of poison. But when the leaf died and dried up, the poison was neutralized and became edible. That prevented the silly isopods from eating the living parts of the ivy. After a while, their population grew even larger, and they began to eat the plantain so quickly that it didn't have enough time to recover. Moreover, the plant itself was already old and had no strength to resist these insatiable little guys. And this is what the terrarium looks like now, more than 2 years after the beginning of the experiment. All that is left of the plantain are dry stems. The ivy plant has grown very large and provides a plentiful food supply. It has proved to be the most tenacious, and perhaps its large root stem has suppressed the growth of the other plants. The cliff that was once covered by the lawn has decreased greatly in size, and a large stick was almost completely eaten by the micro creatures and the isopods. The isopods were constantly breeding. In fact, I always saw some small growing individuals. The white race of the isopods failed to reproduce. Perhaps they were displaced by the more adaptable grey isopods, or perhaps the conditions just weren't suitable for them. By my estimate, there are between 20 and 40 isopods living in the terrarium at this point. The ivy plant and the wooden cliff can keep them alive for at least few more years, maybe even longer. We proved that not only plants but also rather large living creatures can exist and reproduce for many years, even in a closed ecosystem. The generation of isopods that now inhabit the terrarium has never seen wildlife or the natural environment before. I don't want them to never experience that kind of life. Batman also doesn't want to part with them, but deep down he realizes that it will be better for them. That's why I think that after almost 3 years, we can successfully finish the experiment and release the isopods into the wild where they belong. We waited for a warm day and took the terrarium deep into the woods. We couldn't just dump all the soil out of the terrarium, so we decided to leave it in the forest for a few days so they could climb out of it on these thick branches, as well as on the vines of the ivy. And it looks like the first baby is already on its way to its new life. I will miss you, isopods.